In this episode, I'll show you how I made this AC panel insert for my big brother.
Oh wow, that's impressive, Dan.
So this is the casement window that of course would normally be there, but instead I've made this thing that looks somewhat like it to go in its place when he needs to use an AC unit in this game room. Steve initially suggested a piece of plywood, but I thought I'd try and make something a little nicer on the eyes. While at his place, I measured the dimensions of the casement window carefully so that I can try and reproduce it in the basement of my house. In case you're new here, my name's Dan and I love to DIY things like this entry table, this pantry floor, these TV lights, and even this 1949 Spartan Manor camper trailer. And I started off by ripping a piece of plywood down to the width of the window and cross-cut it with a little homemade circular saw guide. Using a ruler, I then drew out the dimensions of the window, which I would have to cut out from the middle of this, including the little dividers between the windows, even though I'm really making this one big window. And to make sure not to mess anything up, I labeled the top of the window. To cut out the window, I carefully lowered a circular saw along the line I drew and slowly moved it along, keeping it as straight as I could. And before you remove the saw, I really recommend letting it come to a full stop. The circular saw was too big for these smaller cuts, so I used a drill to make a hole so I could then run a jigsaw along this line. And again, let the jigsaw come to a stop before you remove it from the wood. As you can see, I have to make a few passes with the jigsaw to get into the corners from each direction. With all the cuts made, we can remove this piece and see that this window is already taking shape. Finally, I just used a flat file to clean up the corners a bit. I used my favorite router bit, the 1/4-inch rabbeting bit. So I'm going to use a piece of plexiglass like this for the window, and I want to embed it in the frame, and to do that we'll use this router. And the first task is to put in the bit and set it to cut to the same depth as the plexiglass. This can be a bit tricky, so I recommend doing a test cut on a piece of scrap material and seeing how it fits. And it's hard to tell with the rough edges, so I use a piece of sandpaper to take those off. It's a little bit thicker still. So I adjust the depth, do another test cut, and see that's still not quite right. No, the plexiglass is a little bit thicker. After a second adjustment, it's just right. There we go. Perfect. Then it's just a matter of routing out the entire perimeter of this window opening, and because of how the router bit cuts, it's best to go in a counterclockwise direction. And as you can see, it has rounded corners, so we'll have to deal with that later. And I knocked down any roughness with a light piece of sandpaper. I have this leftover piece of Plaskolite from repairing my truck canopy, and so we'll make it fit in here. Okay, so that's 6.5. So I mark out the width on the plastic and clamp it down to the bench with a straight piece of plywood acting as a straight edge so that I can score the plastic before breaking it. And here I'm using the edge of a chisel, which did work, but I did have a specific cutting tool for this plastic, but I just couldn't find it. Once I think I've scored about halfway through this plastic, I adjust that score line so it's hanging over the edge of the bench, clamp it down again, and apply some quick pressure to break it cleanly along that line. Now it's hanging by the protective film, which I cut with a razor blade. To cut this pane to the proper length, I repeat the process, but as you can see, it's a much smaller and easier break to make. Here you can see that our plexiglass has a right angle and our wood has a curve in it. And I think the easiest solution is to use a hammer and chisel to cut those curves away into nice straight angles. And with the corners cut, the piece of Plaskolite fits really well. To make this casement window the same thickness as the existing one, I decided to put trim on either side to get it to 1 3/4 inch thickness. So I set the table saw to the width needed for a piece to be on either side. Okay, that's a little short. So I adjust the table saw, cut another scrap piece, and see that it's spot on. Now I can cut the actual trim to the desired thickness with confidence. The trim will meet in the corners at 45-degree angles, so I'll use this miter saw to cut one end on each board to 45 degrees. Then I can line up each corner and mark where to cut the other end at 45 degrees. And I like to make sure to mark what direction the cut needs to go so I don't get confused when I'm using the saw. And it's also handy to mark which piece goes where because they usually aren't exactly the same. As with any cuts for trim, it's good to be cautious and cut a little bit over the line and shave off little bits at a time until you get just the right fit. Here I have both long sides cut to fit, so I'm holding them down with some clamps so I can measure out the short sides. And here I found it easiest to hold it upside down so that I can mark the corner of the longest side more accurately. This first cut was just a bit too long, so here I am trying to shave just a little bit off to make it fit just right. And of course, I did the same thing on the other side. Next, I loaded some short brad nails into my pneumatic nailer, put a few drops of oil in it, and hooked it up to my compressor. And to test the pressure, I fired it into a scrap piece of wood. Perfect. Then I applied wood glue to the perimeter and to the trim, and spread it out with a wood glue brush. After positioning the first piece of trim, I secured it with 2 clamps, then felt along the edge to ensure it was flush, and made any adjustments necessary. Then I secured it further with about a dozen brad nails down its length. With the clamps off, I used a damp rag to wipe away any excess glue. Of course, I then used the same process to attach the other 3 pieces of trim, and then flipped it over and did it all again on the other side. So I couldn't find an exact match for the trim on Steve's existing windows, but this PVC was the same width and would do the job just fine. Just as with the exterior trim, I started off cutting 45 off one end of each piece of trim, measured the other side, and then cut the other side until it fit just right. On this side that doesn't secure the plexiglass in place, I decided to glue this trim down with the Gorilla Glue, and then secured it further with some brad nails. Again, with any kind of trim work like this, it's really important to measure really accurately, and then approach that line very slowly, taking out just slivers of material at a time until it fits just right. Once again, I used glue and brad nails to secure these in place. On the other side, I measured up and cut the trim pieces to fit, but of course need to prime and paint this all before I can insert the window and install the trim. This Kills brand primer was going on well with a cheap brush. I really recommend checking underneath to make sure no drips have formed on the bottom side. That will of course then harden into an annoying lump that you have to sand down later. I used this DAP plastic wood in the white color to fill in all the holes left by the brad nails. This stuff is really stinky, so make sure to use it in a well-ventilated area. I'd also recommend putting as little of this onto your wood as possible because it gets really hard and it's quite a lot of work to sand it off. I gave up trying by hand and went with this block sander, which then removed primer from quite a few areas. I actually don't recommend using the block sander on the PVC because it roughed up the surface quite badly. It's probably hard to see with the camera, but sanding with that block sander actually made quite a rough texture right here, but I don't think I can get it out. For the PVC trim, I went back to sanding by hand. While I had the block sander out, I ran it down the sides to make those just a little bit more pleasant to the touch. I first considered making the hole for the vent in the second section of window from the bottom, but then I saw that the AC unit was not even quite that tall, so the hose would be going up, and I thought that would look awkward. So instead, I centered it in the bottom section of window. To cut the hole in the plexiglass, I thought I'd try this adjustable circle cutter. This is a lot less expensive than buying a 4-inch plus hole saw, but it's definitely a lot more fiddly to set up. I'm not sure if you can see it there, but there's a 2, 3, 4. And I'm trying to line up the edge of that with the 4. So I want to make it a bit bigger actually. Yeah, that should be just about right. And I set my drill press to the lowest speed by moving the little belt here on the pulleys. And it still looks kind of fast for something that big. To test this out and make sure both of the blades were aligned, I drilled down into some rigid foam. That's looking pretty good. So that should work. Let's give it a try. Foam is of course much softer than plexiglass, so I thought I'd test it out on a scrap piece before I did it on my actual window. So this started off looking quite promising, but after a while it seemed like the plastic was just melting and the blades were doing nothing than pushing little globs of melted plastic around. But it did seem to make it halfway through, which is the minimum you want when you're trying to make a clean, straight cut. So I hollowed out this foam a bit so that I could hit the plastic with a hammer and try and knock out that circle. Darn. Since that didn't work, I thought I'd try using this Dremel with a side cutting bit that kind of looks like a regular drill bit, but actually allows you to move through a material a bit like a router. On that same scrap piece, I was able to cut a little piece out, which gave me enough confidence to use this on the final window. So we're going to use it to at least mark the edges of the circle. With the actual window piece clamped in place, I use that circle cutter to mark out the hole. And to hold this plastic securely and hopefully without scratching it, I placed it in its home in the wood, drilled a hole near the edge of the circle, and started carefully using the Dremel. As you can see, this hops around quite a bit, and it's not the easiest to control, but nonetheless, I was able to do about a half circle within a few millimeters of that scribed edge. The plexiglass was jumping around a bit too much, so I clamped it in place and continued cutting with the Dremel. With most of the circle cut out, I then used the Dremel to slowly eat away at the remaining plastic, and I found that some of the time, the plastic would actually break away fairly cleanly near that score line. So it's not the cleanest, but I'm going to use a file and try and get that nice and neat. So that file really helped clean it up, and having that line put in there with the cutter really did help because it seemed like it would clean up right to that edge. Very satisfying. Luckily, he had a can of paint from the previous owners that will be a perfect match for those doors. So at this point, I'm painting all the surfaces that will be in contact, or at least adjacent to the plexiglass, so that I don't have to be careful with the painting later. This includes at least the edges of the trim that will be holding the window in place. With the paint dry, I can now remove the protective film from the plexiglass, put it in position, and start securing it with the trim. With these pieces of trim, I'm not using that construction adhesive because I want to be able to take it out in case anything breaks. So I'm just using brad nails to secure the trim to the wood and ensuring that I'm not hitting the plexiglass with these nails because I think it would crack it. And how good does that look already? So I've taped this to hopefully not scratch up the surface as much. So I'm going to try and cut off a little bit here, and a little bit there. Wish me luck. And as you can see, the table saw did a pretty good job cutting this. I don't really want to file this because I don't want it to lose that edge. So I'm just trying to get off the little melty bits. So I adjust the table saw, cut the other side, break off the little melty bits, and fit the vent in the hole. And then we'll just put a little bead of caulk right there. Or we can have it on this thick side. For the horizontal window dividers, which I think are technically called Muntins, I cut some 3/4 inch pieces of wood, some thicker for one side and thinner for the other. Then I used this 12-inch piece of plywood as a spacer to figure out where each one goes, measure carefully, and just like with the trim, carefully cut it down to size. So that was the thinner side. And of course, I repeated the same thing on the other side with the thicker pieces. And I think that's looking pretty good. And again, because I don't want to paint these once they're against the window, I'm priming them and painting them before I put them in. So if you do paint on a surface like this, make sure to put something small underneath one side to minimize the chance of them getting stuck to the board. I also took the chance to touch up the primer that I had sanded away and then painted the whole panel as well. The back of this plastic dryer vent doesn't look great, so I'm using the circle cutter again to make a little panel to cover that up. And it didn't seem like it'd make it all the way through from one side, so I flipped it over and started again from the other. And that did the trick. After cutting the panel down to size, it fit just right. So I'm going to try sticking these to the acrylic using the carpet tape and this Scotch mount tape. So I don't want water and dust getting between these pieces and the window, so I really want to seal it up in some way. And I could use some kind of caulking, but I don't want it to make a mess and have to clean up around the edges. So I thought some kind of double-sided tape would work well. It's pretty good. Since this is new to me, I'm going to test this out on some scrap pieces of wood and an extra piece of plexiglass. Of course, here you can see the slight difference where this is thicker and this is, of course, much more flat. But the thing I worry about with this one is that if the piece of wood and the paint isn't super flat, then this really thin tape is not going to hold it, whereas this thicker tape could accommodate more bumps and unevenness in the surface. But yeah, look how much more this sticks out. I'm not sure if I like that. And then looking through the other side, and they both look pretty good, but it depends on how the light hits it. So there you can see a lot more bubbling, and over here, looks a bit more smooth. And this is what worries me about this tape, is that I just had this down on the workbench and it's already picked up some sawdust. So I think I'm going to end up using this stuff. Once I decided to go with the carpet tape, it's a simple matter of applying it to the back of each piece. After cleaning the window and letting it dry, I use that same piece of plywood as a 12-inch spacer to place each divider. The trickiest part here was probably just getting the backing peeled off of that tape. Then it was quite satisfying to move down the window, placing a divider every 12 inches. Of course, there's the other side to do still. So it looks pretty good from the back side. And for this side, I didn't use that 12-inch spacer because I was a little bit off because of a slight difference in the trim. So I just stuck these dividers in, aligning them with the ones on the other side. And I think that's looking pretty darn good. And to help hold these dividers in a little bit more, I decided to put a little bead of super glue along each side and wipe away the excess. At this point, it was time for the final layers of paint. These are the casement window sash locks, and they'll go somewhere here, but we'll figure out that exact positioning when we're installing this at Steve's place. And then this aluminum bar is gonna go on the other side to then go into a little gap that's in the door frame to help hold the window in. And I'm gonna make it have the same hole pattern as this so that in case he ever wants to switch which window it's in, he can just, take this one out, put it there, and then swap the sides. And I set up this little block to cut it at exactly 2 inches long. So I want this to have the exact same hole pattern. Using a small scribe, I trace out the location of each hole and then use the center punch to make sure I can drill those holes accurately. I've set up the drill press with a countersink bit so I can make holes that will allow the screw to sit perfectly flush with this aluminum. The holes from the countersink bit were a little bit small, so I ran all these through with a larger drill bit. The edges were a little bit rough, so I used a file to clean those up and make them smooth. And here are our two pieces. The dryer vent has 4 screw holes, and I'm not actually going to screw it in, but I want the appearance of screws. So I'm cutting these little white screw heads off and super gluing them into place. But you'll see, I probably should have used more glue than that. I know it's a small little detail, but wanted to make it look finished. Okay, let's bring this to Steve's. So these are the nice doors in the game room. And it has these little casement windows that open up to a screen, and that's where our thing is gonna go. Well, actually, on this side over here. So theoretically, this should fit right in here. First glance, it is looking pretty good. I do need to put a little bit of foam at the bottom. Darn it, all the screws fell out. So I'm gonna put some of this stuff along the bottom here to help hold it off the ground and make it more level with the rest of the windows. And I actually ended up putting 2 layers of this stuff to get the window to the right height. Wow, that's looking a lot more level. So these are the new window latches I found at the hardware store. On the other windows, there's a bit of a gap to the edge, kind of like that. So let's try and maintain that look. I'm gonna mark the position of the holes. I'm going to drill some pilot holes. Just a little loosely at the beginning. And then the same thing on the bottom lock. All right, so these secure the left side of the window. And now we need to secure this side, see, so it doesn't move like that. And that's what these aluminum plates are for. Do something like that. And so the idea here is to try and get the same hole placement on this side as on that side, so that if he ever wants to move this whole window thing to the other side of the doors, he can just switch that hardware, and hopefully it won't make more holes. So that's what I'm trying to do with this right angle here. Set that up straight across, trace the holes, pilot holes. Of course, it's not the same brass color, but you won't see this very much anyway. And then here's the lower bracket. And wiggling it into position for the last time. All right, there it is, all installed. Not bad. And if you look in here, that little tab, it could still use a bit of a shim just to hold it more snugly against the weather stripping. Other than that, this does its job and holds it steady there. And now we just need to connect the AC unit. And of course, the hose coming from the AC unit is 4.5 inches, and the standard vent pieces I could find are 4. So we need to make this work. And I think I'll use some of that same foam that we used underneath here, wrap it around this, and then we should be able to hose clamp it. Well, it's hard to see the shadow, but actually that's off-white and it's white on the outside. So I could come back and paint this maybe another time. But then that looks pretty good from out here. And here you can see with the unit off, our little vent flaps are closed. And there's with the unit on. And it's quite a bit of air coming through there. And there it is installed. And I think this looks so much better than having a piece of plywood in the window. And just in time too, because it's hot today and I'm sweating so much just putting this in. So I went to get Steve from Mowing His Grass to reveal what I've been working on for the past week.
Did it turn out like you wanted?
Yes.
Oh wow, that's impressive, Dan.
Yeah, it kind of blends in.
It does.
So one thing I didn't know though is that the outside is painted white and not this off-white. So I hope this video has been helpful for you. And if you like videos like this, you might like this one here.
That looks awesome, dude. I'm impressed.
Thanks. It was so fun making it because I didn't want you to have just plywood.